I grew up in a house where love was measured differently, depending on who was receiving it, though no one ever admitted it out loud. At first, it was the small things, the kind of details you could dismiss as a child by telling yourself that maybe you were imagining it. My brother got the bigger slice of cake, the shinier bicycle, the newest clothes, while mine were hand-me-downs. When he spoke, people listened. When I spoke, it felt like my words dissolved in the air, as if the room had been coated with silence just for me. Over the years, these differences built themselves into a structure so steady and unyielding that even I began to accept it as the natural order of our family, as if the hierarchy had been written in the walls of the house long before I was born. My parents always insisted they loved us both equally, that there was no favoritism, but their actions betrayed them more eloquently than any words could. When my brother wanted to join an expensive sports program, they immediately wrote the check, bragging later to relatives about how promising his future looked. When I wanted to join a writing workshop, they told me it was a waste of money, that books didn't pay bills, that I should learn to be practical. I learned then that love wasn't unconditional in my house. It was transactional, and the currency always seemed to favor him. As I grew older, the pattern became sharper, impossible to deny. Holidays revolved around his achievements, his milestones, his presence. He was the star, and I was the supporting act nobody remembered to credit. I tried not to resent it, telling myself that bitterness would only poison me, but I would be lying if I said it didn't sting. Every birthday, every graduation, every family dinner carried the weight of this imbalance, until it became woven into the fabric of who I was. By the time adulthood arrived, I no longer expected equality. I expected disappointment. Still, part of me clung to a fragile hope that one day, in the moments that truly mattered, my parents would see me, not as the secondary character they had assigned me to be, but as their daughter, deserving of the same devotion and investment they had poured so freely into my brother. That hope began to shatter during the months leading up to his wedding. It wasn't just a wedding, it was a coronation. My parents spent $50,000 as though the number meant nothing, as though their savings existed solely for the purpose of placing him at the center of an opulent celebration. I watched the planning unfold like a play I wasn't invited to audition for. The luxurious venue, the tailored suit, the floral arrangements that looked like they belonged in magazines, the endless discussions about the menu and the band. They glowed with pride, their voices rising with excitement whenever they spoke about it. I stayed quiet, smiling when expected, but inside I wondered if this same family, who claimed to love me just as much, would ever raise their voices with the same joy for me. I remember one night, my mother sat at the table with spreadsheets and invoices spread out before her, her glasses perched low on her nose, talking about the best champagne package they could secure. I dared to ask if it wasn't too much, if spending that kind of money wouldn't put strain on them. She barely looked up before answering, "Your brother deserves the best. He's starting his life with his wife, and we want to give him everything we can." The words stung, not just for what they meant, but for what they implied, that I didn't deserve the same. In that moment, a part of me that had clung to hope began to wither, though I didn't realize just how much it would hurt, until it was my turn to stand before them, with a wedding of my own to plan. When I told them I was getting married, their reaction was polite, muted, nothing like the fireworks that had gone off for my brother. They congratulated me, asked a few obligatory questions, and then returned to whatever else filled their day. There was no rush of energy, no late-night planning sessions, no talk of how they could make my day as special as his had been. Deep down, I already knew what would happen, but still, I couldn't stop myself from hoping. Maybe they would surprise me this time. Maybe they would finally show me that I was not invisible. But in the back of my mind, I carried the heavy knowledge that in our family, my brother was the sun, and I was only allowed to be a shadow. Looking back now, I see how every slight, every overlooked moment, every subtle dismissal built a quiet strength inside me, even as it hurt. I learned how to endure being second, how to smile when I wanted to scream, how to let silence say what words never could. That endurance would eventually become the foundation for the decision that changed everything. But before that, I had to face the final insult, the one that would turn all those years of imbalance into a truth I could no longer ignore. It began not with cruelty in their voices, but with the sound of cash being folded into an envelope. $40, offered with the same casualness one might use to tip a waiter, and handed to me as if that was all my future was worth. But that moment, that insult disguised as a gift, belongs to another chapter. For now, all that matters is understanding how years of unequal treatment taught me to recognize that my value would never be measured fairly in their eyes, and that the only way to reclaim myself was to stop asking them to see me at all. The announcement of my brother's wedding arrived like a royal decree, the kind that instantly shifted the entire atmosphere of the household. My parents beamed with a pride I had rarely seen directed at me, their eyes alive with excitement, as though his decision to marry elevated the entire family's status. The details flowed quickly, each one more extravagant than the last, and I found myself seated at the edge of the living room couch as they spoke about venues with vaulted ceilings, chandeliers that sparkled like constellations, and a guest list that read more like a registry of social ambitions than of family intimacy. It was not merely a wedding. It was a spectacle designed to showcase their success as parents. A performance where my brother was the star, and they were the producers making sure every light pointed at him. I listened silently, smiling faintly when someone turned toward me as if seeking confirmation that I too was swept up in the magic, though the truth was that each sentence drove home the reality of my place within this family dynamic. The observer, never the celebrated. The weeks that followed were a blur of appointments and purchases, decisions made with the ease of a limitless wallet. $50,000 seemed to appear from nowhere, as if the figure itself were a minor detail compared to the glory of the event. I remember standing in the kitchen one evening, watching my father write a check with the steady hand of someone who did not flinch at the zeros trailing the number. They hired photographers known for magazine spreads, booked a ballroom so vast it could have swallowed our entire house, and selected menus that read like novels of decadence. Whenever relatives visited, the conversations revolved around the grandeur that was to come, and I sat there listening, nodding at the right places, my presence fading into the background while their words built a cathedral of celebration around my brother. It wasn't only the money, it was the attention, the devotion, the way they seemed to orbit him like he was the center of gravity. My mother spent hours poring over fabric swatches and centerpiece designs, her energy tireless, her voice carrying the sharp edge of authority as she demanded perfection from vendors. My father became a man on a mission, negotiating deals, securing extras, making sure his son's wedding would be remembered for years. Their faces glowed with pride, their voices softened with admiration whenever they spoke his name, as though he had achieved something monumental simply by choosing a partner. In those moments, I realized that love in our house had always been tangled with performance, and my brother was the chosen performer, granted the stage, the spotlight, and the applause. The day itself was everything they had promised, and more. I can still recall the glittering hall, the flowers that seemed to breathe perfume into every corner, the champagne that flowed endlessly, as though the very air had turned to celebration. My mother cried delicate tears as she clutched his arm. My father's chest swelled with pride, and relatives whispered about how splendid it all was, how generous and devoted my parents had been. The word perfect floated across the room countless times, attaching itself to every detail, and with each repetition, I felt the chasm widen between us. When the music soared and the couple danced their first dance beneath cascading lights, I clapped with everyone else, my face a mask of joy. But inside, I felt the cold weight of invisibility pressing harder than ever. For me, the wedding was not just a celebration of my brother's new life. It was a mirror reflecting my own absence. No one asked what I thought of the decorations, or whether I too dreamed of such a day. No one wondered if I felt the sting of being overshadowed, not just in the present but in the promise of the future. I knew then, with a clarity that could not be ignored, that when my time came, it would not be the same. My parents had poured themselves into him, emptied their wallets and their pride into his moment, and what remained for me would be little more than scraps. Still, I held onto a thin strand of hope, fragile and trembling, that perhaps they would surprise me, that perhaps when my own wedding came they would realize the years of imbalance and seek to mend them with generosity, not necessarily in money, but in recognition. in love, in the simple act of making me feel valued. Yet even as I clung to that hope, I could sense the truth waiting for me like a shadow in the corner of the room. Every toast raised to my brother, every proud declaration from my parents about how they had spared no expense, was another stitch in the fabric of a narrative that excluded me. By the time the night ended and the hall emptied, I stood outside in the cool air, the laughter and music still ringing faintly in my ears, and I told myself something I did not want to admit. When my turn came, there would be no cathedral of light, no glittering hall, no endless champagne. There would be silence, a token gesture, perhaps even an insult disguised as support. And yet, despite knowing this deep inside, I could not help but wish, foolishly, that I was wrong, that one day they might look at me the way they looked at him. That hope would carry me into the next chapter of my life, only to be broken in the most humiliating way possible, with an envelope, a few crumpled bills, and the unmistakable message that in their eyes, my worth had always been less. When my brother's wedding ended, and the echoes of applause faded from the grand hall my parents had paid for so proudly, life returned to its quieter rhythm. I carried on with my days, watching as the photographs from his ceremony occupied places of honor in our home. My mother displayed them with a kind of reverence, carefully arranging the frames on shelves and tables, ensuring that every visitor would be reminded of the perfection she and my father had orchestrated. The images were constant reminders of the night they had elevated my brother into something almost untouchable, a night where love and money had flowed together as though there were no limit. I told myself to be patient. I told myself that perhaps things would be different when it was my turn. That maybe, after years of imbalance, I would finally be recognized not as the shadow, but as a daughter equally deserving of joy, attention, and support. The moment arrived sooner than I expected. I still remember how my heart raced when I first told them I was engaged. It was a quiet afternoon, the sun spilling lazily across the kitchen tiles, and I thought perhaps the simplicity of the moment would allow my news to shine. Their reactions, however, were muted, almost perfunctory. My mother's eyebrows lifted briefly, her lips curling into a small, polite smile, and my father's hand gave one distracted pat on my shoulder before he returned his attention to whatever paperwork lay in front of him. They said the words, "Congratulations," but they landed in the room with the weight of routine rather than excitement. There were no squeals of delight, no exclamations about how they must start planning immediately, no insistence on hearing every detail about the proposal or my hopes for the ceremony. It was as if my announcement had been just another item in a long list of things they had to acknowledge before dinner. Still, I persisted. I began talking about ideas for the wedding, painting a picture with my words of what I imagined. Something modest, perhaps not the cathedral of grandeur my brother had, but something dignified and beautiful, something that would make me feel cherished. I did not ask for $50,000 or anything close to it, but I hoped for the gesture, for proof that they saw me as more than an afterthought. I hoped that they would set aside the same devotion of spirit, if not of money, to ensure my day carried the dignity any bride would wish for. My voice faltered when I asked if they might help me, if they could contribute to the expenses. It was a small request, laced with an optimism I was almost embarrassed to admit still lived inside me. For days afterward, they said little. I waited, my chest tight with anticipation every time I entered the living room or heard them speaking quietly behind closed doors. I thought perhaps they were planning something in secret. Perhaps they were preparing to surprise me. I imagined scenarios where they might present me with a check, maybe even less than what they gave my brother, but still significant, enough to prove that I mattered. In the solitude of my room, I let myself dream of walking down an aisle with them watching proudly, of photographs that would hang beside my brother's on the family shelves, of feeling for once that I was not invisible. Then came the day they summoned me into the living room. My father sat in his chair with an expression I could not read, and my mother beside him with her hands folded neatly on her lap. For a moment, I thought it was finally happening, that they had decided to invest in me, in my future, the way they had so freely done for my brother. My father reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. My heart leapt at the sight of it, hope flooding me despite the years of evidence that should have warned me otherwise. He handed it to me with a small smile. as though the gesture itself carried great meaning. When I opened it, the world seemed to collapse into silence. Inside was $40, two 20s, folded crisply but carelessly, as if they had been plucked from a wallet without much thought. I stared at the bills, my fingers trembling, waiting for an explanation, waiting for the punchline that would reveal this as some kind of strange prelude to a larger gift. But no words came. My mother simply said, "This should help a little," her tone light, as if she had offered me a coupon rather than the symbol of her indifference. My father nodded, as though the matter was settled, as though $40 could possibly represent the same kind of love, pride, and support they had showered upon my brother. In that moment, I felt every year of neglect, every unequal gesture, every slight preference crash down on me in one brutal wave. It was not the money itself, $40 or $50,000. The true wound was the message. They had decided my worth. They had placed a price tag on their daughter, and it was less than the cost of a dinner out. The memory of chandeliers and champagne from my brother's wedding stabbed at me, mocking me, reminding me of just how deep the chasm ran between us. I should have cried, should have screamed, but instead, something colder took hold. I smiled. I slipped the envelope into my hand with a calmness that startled even me. I thanked them softly, though the words tasted bitter in my mouth. They believed they had given me enough, and I let them believe it. What they did not know was that in that moment of insult, something inside me hardened into resolve. I would not beg for recognition. I would not plead for fairness. I would not ask again. I would take their token, their insult disguised as charity, and I would build something far greater with it, not through their money, but through my refusal to let them define me. That envelope, those $40, became the boundary line between the daughter who had waited all her life for equality and the woman who would no longer wait for anything. It was the final lesson they would ever teach me, though not in the way they intended. The rest of the story, what I chose to do with that insult, how I turned their indifference into liberation, was already beginning to write itself in the silence of my smile. The envelope sat in my hand like a cruel joke, its weight negligible, yet heavy enough to crush years of fragile hope I had carried with me. I had spent so long convincing myself that maybe, when it was my turn, my parents would finally step into the role they had so proudly performed for my brother. I had told myself that perhaps they would surprise me, that somewhere beneath their history of imbalance lay a desire to treat me with the dignity a daughter deserves. But as I stared down at the two $20 bills, crisp and almost mocking in their ordinariness, I knew that no surprise was coming. No hidden generosity lay waiting in the wings. This was it. This was what they thought I was worth. $40, the kind of money someone presses into the palm of a teenager heading out to the movies, not the kind of support a parent offers a daughter standing on the threshold of marriage. My mother watched me with a look of finality, as if the gesture had closed the conversation before it even began. "This should help a little," she had said, her tone casual, almost cheerful, as though she had given me something significant. My father leaned back in his chair with the satisfied air of someone who had done his duty. They did not look at me with pride, or love, or even the faintest understanding of what such a gesture represented. Instead, they looked at me as if they had discharged an obligation, as if this pitiful offering absolved them of any further responsibility. I stood there, my fingers trembling against the paper, but my face remained composed. Years of practice had taught me how to mask disappointment, how to smile when I felt like breaking. I smiled then too, though inside me something shifted irreversibly. I thought of my brother's wedding, of the $50,000 that had flowed so easily from their pockets, of the champagne towers, the flowers spilling from gilded vases, the endless photographs that had filled our home afterward. I thought of the pride in their voices when they described the event to anyone who would listen, of the way they spoke about their son as if he were a prince beginning his reign. And then I thought of myself, standing in this same house, holding an envelope so insultingly thin it might have been filled with receipts rather than money, and I realized that no matter how hard I tried, I would never stand on equal ground with him in their eyes. What hurt most was not the money itself. I could have lived with less if love and recognition had filled the gap, but the message it carried. $40 was not about financial support. It was about value. It was a silent declaration that I was not worth investing in, that my happiness did not justify sacrifice, that my place in this family was forever beneath my brother's. It was the culmination of years of small slights and quiet neglect, condensed into a single gesture so sharp it cut through me like glass. And yet, instead of bleeding, I felt myself harden. I slipped the envelope into my purse, thanked them softly, and walked away. They believed my gratitude. They mistook my composure for acceptance. They did not see the storm that brewed behind my calm eyes, did not sense the steel that had replaced the fragile hope inside me. They thought the matter was settled, that their role in my wedding had been fulfilled with $40. They did not realize that in that moment, they had handed me not just money, but freedom. I remember lying awake that night, the envelope still unopened on my dresser, staring at the ceiling as the house settled into silence. I thought about all the years I had spent yearning for their approval, all the times I had swallowed my disappointment and convinced myself that maybe the next time would be different. I thought of the child who had waited for applause that never came, the teenager who had tried to shine only to be overshadowed, the young woman who still believed against all reason that her parents would one day treat her with equality. And I realized that she was gone. In her place stood someone new, someone who no longer sought validation from people who had shown, over and over, that they were unwilling to give it. The $40 became a symbol, not of insult, but of release. It was the final lesson they would ever teach me, though not in the way they intended. They had shown me, without words, that my worth in their eyes would never rise above the scraps they were willing to spare. And so I decided, in that quiet moment, that I would no longer measure myself by their scale. I would no longer wait for their applause, or their approval, or their love. I would take the $40, their final verdict on my value, and I would walk away with a smile. They thought they had humiliated me, diminished me, but in truth, they had liberated me. In the days that followed, I carried the envelope with me, unopened, as though it were a talisman of the life I was leaving behind. I did not argue with them, did not demand more, did not attempt to explain what their gesture meant. I simply let them believe they had given me enough. I answered their questions politely, kept my tone even, and offered them no glimpse into the plans that were already forming in my mind. For years, I had been the daughter who hoped, the daughter who waited. Now, I was becoming the woman who would no longer ask. That envelope of $40 was the last piece of evidence I needed, the proof that the imbalance I had felt all my life was not imagined, but real, tangible, undeniable. It was the insult that turned into clarity, the small sum that revealed the true scale of my family's love. And in that clarity, I found a strength I had never known before. I would not fight them for recognition. I would not beg them to see me. I would not waste another moment hoping for equality. I would take what they had given me, smile as though it were enough, and then disappear into a future they would never control. The next chapter of my life had already begun, and though they did not know it yet, their role in it was already over. When I walked out of the living room with the envelope tucked neatly in my purse, I carried more than 2 bills of $20 each. I carried the weight of years spent balancing hope against disappointment, of believing that someday my parents would recognize me with the same fervor and generosity they had so freely poured into my brother. But instead of crumbling under the insult, something else emerged inside me, cold, steady, and unyielding. That smile I had offered them, soft and calm, was not the expression of a grateful daughter, but the mask of a woman who had finally stopped waiting. They believed they had closed a chapter with their small gesture, but in reality, they had opened a door I had long been too afraid to cross. I spent the following days moving through the world differently, almost as though I were walking through glass. Everything looked sharper, clearer, each detail refracted through the lens of that moment when I realized, with absolute certainty, that my worth would never be acknowledged in that house. Conversations with my parents became rehearsed and polite, stripped of any lingering desire for closeness. I answered their questions about my upcoming wedding with vague phrases, letting them think I was still in the early stages of planning. They never pressed further. Perhaps they assumed the $40 had bought them silence, or maybe they truly believed it was enough. Either way, I stopped offering them pieces of myself they did not value. At night, when the house was quiet and their voices no longer filled the air, I would lie in bed, and imagine a different kind of ceremony. Not one steeped in glittering chandeliers and orchestrated perfection like my brother's, but something intimate, free of the spectacle they adored so much. I pictured vows spoken under open sky rather than gilded ceilings, a celebration not of wealth, but of love, a moment crafted for me rather than for their approval. Slowly, the idea of elopement began to take shape in my mind, not as an act of desperation, but as an act of defiance, of liberation. I did not need their money, their blessing, or their applause. I needed only my own courage to step away and create something that was mine, untainted by the imbalance that had haunted my life. In the days that followed, I carried their $40 as though it were both a burden and a key. Every time I touched the envelope, I was reminded of the insult it represented, but I was also reminded of the clarity it had given me. I began to see their indifference not as a wound but as an answer, the final proof that I had always been waiting in vain. That realization hardened into resolve. I would not invite them into my happiness only to watch them treated as a footnote. I would not give them the chance to diminish me on the most important day of my life. My smile that day had fooled them, but it had also sealed my decision. I would take their gift, small as it was, and turn it into the beginning of a story they would never control. I remember the first time I mentioned elopement to my fiancé, the words slipping from my lips almost without thought. He looked at me with surprise at first, then with understanding, as though he too had sensed the shadow my family cast over me. There was no judgment in his eyes, only quiet agreement, and in that moment, I felt a kind of solidarity I had never known within my own bloodline. Together, we began to imagine what our day would look like. Simple, authentic, untouched by the expectations of others. It was not about running away, but about reclaiming something that had always been stolen from me, the right to define my own worth. I kept my composure around my parents, answering their casual questions with vague answers, offering smiles that concealed the storm beneath. They believed I was still in the process of planning, still waiting for their guidance and support. They never asked for details, never offered to help beyond what they had already given, as if their gesture of $40 had settled the matter completely. Their silence was almost convenient. It allowed me to move forward without interference. Each day that passed, I felt lighter, as though the chains of expectation were loosening, replaced by the steady rhythm of a plan unfolding in secret. There were moments when the old habits of hope tried to creep back in, when I would glance at them and wonder if perhaps, even now, they might notice the distance in my eyes and reach out to bridge it. But those moments grew fewer, and each time they passed more quickly. The more I imagined my future without their presence overshadowing it, the freer I felt. The smile I had given them on the day of the envelope became my shield, a silent barrier that kept my true intentions safe while I prepared to step into a new life. Looking back, I realized that my decision did not begin with elopement itself, but with that smile. It was the moment I chose not to confront, not to plead, not to expose my pain to people who had never cared to see it. It was the moment I chose silence over argument, strategy over desperation. That smile, small and calm, was the beginning of my escape. It was the first step toward building a life where my value would not be measured in dollar amounts or in comparison to someone else. It was the quiet declaration of a woman who had decided, once and for all, not to be the victim of her own family's indifference. And so, while they went about their days believing they had given enough, I walked quietly toward a future they would not recognize until it was already too late. My cold smile had hidden everything from them, but inside it carried the weight of a decision that would change everything. For the first time in my life, I was no longer waiting for them to see me. I was preparing to disappear, not into invisibility, but into a life they would never again have the power to diminish. The decision to elope did not come to me all at once, like lightning striking the ground, but rather as a slow-burning fire that grew each day. I carried the envelope with its 2 lonely bills of 20 tucked into my purse. At first, the thought arrived in fragments, images drifting into my mind at night when the house was still, and the silence was heavy with unspoken truths. I would see myself standing under an open sky, saying vows with no audience, no spotlight, no stage performance orchestrated for the sake of appearances. The more those images returned, the more I realized they were not fantasies but possibilities. Possibilities that could free me from the charade my family had forced me into for as long as I could remember. By the time the idea had settled fully, it was no longer a question of whether I would elope, but when. I began to plan quietly, weaving details into my days without anyone noticing. While my mother occupied herself with reminiscing about my brother's lavish ceremony, and my father buried himself in work, I charted a different course, one that required no grand venue or towering floral arrangements. I searched for places that spoke to simplicity and truth, small corners of the world where promises could be made without a stage, where the moment would belong to me, and not to the performance my parents had always expected of their children. My fiancé was my only confidant, and though at first he was taken aback by the idea of stepping away from tradition, his eyes softened when he saw the determination in mine. He understood that this was not rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was survival. It was my chance to claim one moment of my life entirely for myself, free of the hierarchy that had always placed me beneath my brother. We talked late into the night about what our elopement might look like. Some evenings we imagined traveling far away, to mountains or seasides, where no one would know us and the world would shrink down to just two people exchanging vows. Other times we spoke of something even quieter, perhaps a courthouse ceremony followed by a walk hand in hand through city streets, our rings glinting as the only evidence of what had taken place. What mattered most was not the location or the formality, but the fact that it would be ours, untouched by the indifference of those who had dismissed me so easily. Each version of the plan felt more freeing than the last, and as the details began to settle, I felt a calmness spread through me that I had never known before. It was strange, how the insult of $40 had transformed into a gift of clarity. With every passing day, the bitterness I once carried began to dissolve, replaced by a kind of quiet resolve. I no longer felt the need to fight for their attention, no longer felt the sting of being overlooked. Their indifference had become my liberation, their insult my permission to walk away. The elopement became more than a wedding plan. It became a symbol of a life no longer defined by their scales of worth. For the first time, I was writing my own script, one where I was not a supporting character, but the author of the entire story. Of course, I kept my plans hidden. When my parents asked casual questions about the wedding, I gave them vague answers, letting them believe I was still searching for venues or waiting to set a date. They did not press further. Perhaps they assumed I lacked the ambition to create something grand, or perhaps they simply didn't care enough to ask. Either way, their disinterest gave me freedom. They never suspected that I was already arranging the details of a ceremony they would never attend, a celebration they would only learn about after it was long over. Each polite smile I gave them was another brick in the wall I was building between us, a wall that would become unscalable once my plans were complete. There were moments, I admit, when the weight of tradition pressed against me, whispering that a daughter should want her parents present on such a day, that walking away was unnatural. But those moments faded quickly when I remembered the envelope, when I thought of the pride in their eyes at my brother's wedding, and the absence of even a flicker of that pride for me. What kind of presents would they bring to my ceremony? One of judgment, comparison, and indifference. I wanted no part of that. I wanted to walk into marriage without the shadow of their favoritism, staining the beginning of my life with the man I loved. So the elopement became our secret project, the quiet defiance that stitched itself into our days. I did not need chandeliers or champagne. I needed only the assurance that my vows were real, that my joy was mine alone, unmeasured by the shallow calculations of those who had failed me. In a way, it felt poetic. My brother's wedding had been a spectacle of wealth and performance, but mine would be stripped to its essence. Two people choosing each other without audience, without spectacle, without permission. The thought of it filled me with a serenity I had never felt, as though for the first time the scales were balanced, not by my parents' approval, but by my own choice to step beyond it. By the time the date approached, my resolve had hardened into certainty. There was no turning back, no hesitation left in me. My parents had unknowingly freed me when they handed me that envelope. They had taught me that I could never expect equality under their roof, so I no longer sought it. Instead, I sought love, truth, and freedom in a form they would never understand. And as the plan settled into place, I felt a sense of anticipation rise in me, not the kind born from spectacle and grandeur, but from the quiet, steady knowledge that I was walking toward a future of my own making, one that would no longer be weighed down by the smallness of their vision. The elopement was no longer just a plan. It was my reclamation, my declaration, the silent decision I had carried within me since the day they placed that envelope in my hand. And soon, it would no longer be an idea but a reality they would only glimpse when it was already too late to stop it, too late to diminish it, too late to claim any part of it for themselves. The morning of my wedding arrived not with the clamor of family members rushing to prepare, not with hairdressers and photographers filling the house, not with the frenzied orchestration of a grand event, but with quiet sunlight slipping through the curtains and the sound of my own breathing steady in my chest. There were no frantic phone calls, no endless instructions shouted across rooms, no parents bustling around with a checklist of expenses they had covered proudly. For them, this day did not exist, and that was exactly how I wanted it. I woke with a clarity that felt almost sacred, knowing that while my parents still believed I was somewhere in the early stages of planning, still comparing venues and counting pennies, I was instead about to step into the life I had chosen for myself. The ceremony we had arranged was simple, stripped of excess but rich in meaning. There was no golden hall, no chandeliers dripping with crystals, no tables groaning beneath the weight of elaborate feasts. Instead, there was a small courthouse with tall windows that let the daylight flood in, illuminating the worn wooden benches and the quiet dignity of the space. My fiancé and I had chosen it precisely because it was unassuming, because it required nothing from anyone but us. It was not a performance. It was a promise. When I walked into that room, holding his hand, I felt lighter than I ever had before, as though I had left years of expectation behind me the moment I stepped through the doors. The officiant spoke in a calm, measured tone, guiding us through vows that felt heavier than anything I had ever spoken yet, freeing in their simplicity. There was no audience to applaud, no parents to wipe tears dramatically, no relatives to gossip in the corners about the cost of the arrangements. It was only us, the words we exchanged, and the silence that made those words echo louder than any orchestra ever could. I looked at him as I said my vows, and for the first time in my life, I felt that I was not competing for someone's recognition or fighting to prove my worth. I was simply being chosen, and I was choosing in return. That was all that mattered. Afterward, we walked outside into the afternoon air, the world carrying on around us as though nothing monumental had happened. People passed by, cars rolled along the streets, children laughed from a nearby park. To them, it was just another day. To us, it was everything. There was no limousine waiting, no cameras flashing, no grand reception hall filled with people pretending to toast our happiness. Instead, we walked together, hand in hand, down the street, stopping at a small cafe where we ordered coffee and a slice of cake to share. It was quiet, almost absurdly ordinary, and yet it felt profound. There was no spectacle, no borrowed pride. There was only us, beginning our life with something real, something entirely our own. That evening, when the sky deepened into shades of purple and gold, we sat in a small rented room, still in our wedding clothes, eating takeout from paper containers, laughing softly as we replayed the day in our minds. We didn't need anyone's approval or applause. We had each other, and in that simplicity, I found more richness than I had ever seen in the opulence of my brother's wedding. The photographs my parents had displayed of him under glittering chandeliers meant nothing compared to the memory of us sitting cross-legged on the floor, rings newly shining on our fingers, tasting noodles from mismatched chopsticks, and knowing we had done something brave. Meanwhile, my parents continued their lives unaware. They spoke casually in the following days about how I must still be searching for the right venue, how it was wise of me to take my time, since weddings were such expensive affairs. My mother complained once about how she hoped I wouldn't expect them to help beyond what they had already given, and I smiled faintly, nodding as though her words mattered. In truth, her complaint slid off me like rain on glass, because I no longer needed her investment, financial or emotional. I had already married, already created my moment without her, already closed the door on the imbalance she had forced me to live with. The irony of it all was that the wedding I had chosen felt more authentic, more mine. than anything they could have built with $50,000. My brother's night had been one of spectacle, one designed for others to admire, one that served as proof of our parents' supposed devotion. Mine, though smaller and hidden, was real. It was not for them, not for anyone but us. And as I lay down to sleep that night, my new husband beside me, I realized I had given myself the greatest gift: freedom from their script, freedom from their scale of worth. The day my parents thought did not exist was the day that set me free. It was the day I learned that happiness was not measured by chandeliers or applause, not by the weight of a checkbook or the spectacle of a celebration. It was measured in truth, in love, in the quiet decision to walk away from those who could not see me and to stand with the one who always had. And while they would continue to live believing my moment was still somewhere in the future, I had already lived it, and it had been perfect in ways they would never understand. The silence lasted for weeks, and I wore it like a cloak, moving through my days with the calm of someone who no longer owed explanations. My parents seemed satisfied in their ignorance, content to assume that I was still circling endlessly through plans I could not afford, still wavering in indecision, while their $40 sat as my only supposed lifeline. But time has a way of forcing questions into even the most indifferent minds, and soon enough, their curiosity began to seep through the cracks. The first call came on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of day when my mother usually busied herself with routines, cooking meals in a kitchen that still carried the faint ghosts of family dinners we no longer shared. Her voice on the line was casual at first, polite even, but beneath it, I could hear the hunger for information. "So," she asked lightly, "have you made any progress with the wedding plans?" I could almost picture her adjusting a framed photograph of my brother's lavish ceremony as she spoke, her eyes flitting across the glittering image that had long since become her shrine. I answered with practiced calm, offering vague words about how we were still considering our options, about how costs were high and time was short. I spoke in circles, providing enough to sound believable, but not enough to satisfy. She hummed in response, the sound of someone both unconcerned and impatient. I ended the call quickly, before her curiosity could dig deeper, and for a while, the silence returned. But then the calls began to multiply. My father's voice appeared one evening, rougher, edged with the kind of suspicion that always came when something fell outside of his control. "Your mother says you've been quiet about the wedding," he said. "What's going on? You can't leave these things until the last minute." I assured him we were handling it, that he didn't need to worry. He grunted, unconvinced, but let the matter drop, perhaps comforted by the belief that I was still fumbling within the boundaries they had set for me. As the weeks passed, their questions grew sharper, tinged with the frustration of exclusion. My mother began asking for dates, for venues, for guest lists. She spoke as though she were already owed an invitation, as though her mere existence guaranteed her place at a table she had never truly earned. I deflected each question with the same calm precision, my voice steady, my words elusive. I could hear the irritation building in her tone, the confusion that came from realizing she was no longer in control of the narrative. Once, she asked directly, "Are you hiding something from us?" And I smiled at the phone in my hand, amused by the irony. I told her no, of course not. Why would I? She sighed, unconvinced, and changed the subject. But I knew the seed of doubt had taken root. Their calls became more frequent after that, each one carrying a new layer of urgency. They wanted photographs, details, proof that I was still moving along the expected path. My father asked about deposits. My mother asked about dresses. I answered everything with a careful vagueness that gave them nothing and everything at once. And through it all, I felt no guilt, no burden of deception. For years, I had lived under their shadow, forced to measure myself against a brother whose worth had been inflated with their endless sacrifices. Now, for the first time, I held something they could not buy, could not control, could not diminish. The truth sat quietly between my new husband and me, a truth they could not touch. We were already married, already living the life they had denied me in every symbolic way, and their questions were nothing but echoes bouncing off the walls of their own blindness. There was a particular satisfaction in their growing restlessness, in the way they began to sense that something had slipped through their fingers. My mother, ever the curator of appearances, pressed harder for photographs, her voice sharp with the need to display her daughter's wedding as another jewel in the family's crown. She wanted something to show, something to prove that her other child had not been forgotten, that she too had fulfilled her role as a mother. But I gave her nothing. Each time she asked, I deflected, my smile unseen, but felt in the calmness of my replies. "We'll share pictures when the time is right," I told her once, and she bristled, clearly unaccustomed to being denied. The irony was sharp and undeniable. They had withheld their support, measured my worth in 2 crumpled bills, dismissed my future with a gesture that would not have paid for even a single bouquet of flowers. Yet now, suddenly, they wanted to be included, wanted to possess the evidence of my happiness so they could parade it before others. They had no idea that the moment had already passed, that the wedding had already taken place without them, that their absence was not an oversight, but a deliberate choice. Every call they made, every question they asked, only deepened the divide, turning their hunger for details into proof of just how much they had already lost. I answered each call with the same calm tone, but inside, I felt a growing strength, a sense of control I had never known before. I no longer feared their judgment, no longer craved their recognition. Their curiosity was powerless now, a futile grasping at a story they had chosen not to be part of when they placed that envelope in my hand. And so I let them call, let them ask, let them grow restless with the silence I fed them. I knew the truth they would one day learn, the truth that would cut sharper than any words I could speak, that I had already eloped, already built my happiness without them, already closed the door they had never cared enough to walk through. The calls and questions became their punishment, though they did not yet realize it. Each time they reached out, they revealed their own desperation, their own fear of being left behind. And I, for once, no longer felt like the overlooked daughter, or the shadow beside my brother's shining light. I felt like someone who had finally seized control of her own story, someone who had turned silence into strength and absence into power. They would keep calling, keep asking, keep wondering, until the day came when I gave them the answer that would silence them forever. And when that day arrived, I would speak with the same calmness I had carried all along, the calmness of someone who had already walked away. It happened on an ordinary evening, one of those moments when the world outside seemed to move with its usual rhythm, but the air inside my home felt charged with a tension that had been building for weeks. Their calls had grown relentless by then, no longer softened with polite curiosity, but sharpened with irritation, with a kind of desperation that betrayed how excluded they felt. My mother had called earlier in the day, her voice tight and brittle, demanding to know why I still had not sent her a single photograph, not even a small glimpse of the dress she was so sure I must have bought. She spoke as if the absence of pictures was a personal insult, as if my silence was a stain on her carefully crafted image of motherhood. My father followed later, his voice gruffer, his questions blunt and unforgiving. He wanted dates, receipts, proof that I was not embarrassing them with negligence. I listened in silence, my patience stretched to its limit, until at last I realized the time had come to give them the truth, not with anger or theatrics, but with the same calmness that had carried me from the moment they handed me that envelope. When the phone rang again that night, I answered with steady hands. My mother's voice, sharp and urgent, spilled through the line. "We need to know. When is the wedding? Your relatives are asking, and we cannot keep telling them we don't know." "Where are the photos? Where is the proof?" I let her words rush over me, let them echo in the quiet of my living room, and then, with a tone so even, it startled even me, I said, "There won't be a wedding for you to attend. I already eloped." The silence that followed was vast, heavy, almost suffocating. For a moment I wondered if the line had gone dead, but then came her voice again, high-pitched and disbelieving. "What do you mean, eloped? You can't be serious." I smiled faintly, though she could not see it, and answered, "I am serious. I eloped weeks ago. There was no ceremony for you, no photos for you, no celebration you could claim as yours. It was mine, and it will remain mine. Forever." The word forever hung between us like a locked door, final and unyielding. I could hear her breathing quicken on the other end, the shock breaking through her composure. She stammered, trying to gather herself, But there was no argument she could make, no ground she could reclaim. My father's voice soon joined hers, demanding to know if I understood what I had done, if I realized how selfish, how cruel it was to exclude them. His words struck me as almost laughable, considering the cruelty they had shown me with their $40 envelope, the selfishness they had cloaked in indifference for years. I did not raise my voice, did not allow their anger to pull me into chaos. I simply repeated, "It was my choice, and it is final. There will be no photographs sent, no stories shared, no belated role for you to play. That part of my life does not belong to you." The silence that followed was different this time. Less shock, more wounded pride. They wanted to argue, to reclaim authority, but there was nothing left for them to hold. The ceremony had already happened, the vows already spoken, the life already begun without them. My words had closed the door, and I could almost hear the echo of it slamming in their ears. Their voices faltered, their certainty crumbling, and for once, I felt no guilt. I felt only the quiet relief of someone who had finally spoken the truth aloud. After the call ended, I sat in the stillness of my home, the weight of what I had done settling into me. It did not feel like loss. It felt like release. I had given them the final answer, the one that would haunt them not because it was cruel, but because it was undeniable. For once, I had chosen myself over their approval, my peace over their control. And as I sat there, I realized that the forever I had spoken was not just about the elopement, but about the distance I had claimed. I would not go back to hoping, to waiting, to begging for scraps of recognition. I had stepped beyond that, into a future where my worth was not up for debate. In the days that followed, their calls slowed, their voices quieter when they did reach me. I think they knew, finally, that I meant every word. There was no bargaining with someone who had already walked away, no reclaiming a place in a story that had already been written without them. They had chosen to measure my worth in 2 crumpled bills, and I had chosen to answer with silence, with absence, with the kind of truth that cannot be undone. And though they may never admit it, I know that my answer cut deeper than any spectacle ever could. For them, the absence of photographs, of proof, of stories to parade before others, was a wound greater than money could fix. For me, it was freedom. The moment I severed the last thread of dependence, the moment I claimed my life as wholly mine. And I knew then that forever was not just a word I had spoken to them, but the shape of my new reality, one in which they no longer held the power to define me. In the weeks that followed my final words to them, life settled into a rhythm that felt both unfamiliar and astonishingly natural, as though I had finally slipped into the skin I had always been meant to wear. The silence from my parents grew thicker with each passing day, not the kind of silence filled with peace, but the brittle quiet of pride wounded beyond repair. They called less and less, and when they did, the conversations were short, clipped, voices heavy with the weight of what had been lost but never acknowledged. I did not push them, did not try to reopen doors that had already closed. Instead, I allowed the distance to grow, let the silence expand until it became a wall that could no longer be climbed. For once, I was not the one waiting, not the one hoping, not the one standing on the outside begging to be let in. I was the one who had walked away. With each day that passed, I found myself rediscovering parts of me that had long been buried under years of comparison and neglect. I began to write again, words pouring out of me as though they had been waiting for this freedom, as though my voice had been shackled all along by the desperate need for approval that no longer bound me. I decorated my new home slowly, carefully, with pieces that felt like me, not like the echoes of a family that had never really seen me. I laughed more easily, slept more peacefully, and when I looked at my husband, I saw not just the man I had chosen, but the life we had built together, untouched by the weight of their indifference. Sometimes, when I walked through town and saw mothers fussing over daughters, helping them carry shopping bags filled with wedding dresses or fussing with veils, I felt a faint tug of grief for the moments I would never have. But that grief was fleeting, quickly replaced by the stronger knowledge that what I had gained was far greater than what I had lost. I had freed myself from the endless hunger for their approval, from the exhaustion of trying to prove I was worthy of the same love they had lavished on my brother. I had chosen a path that, while quieter and lonelier in some ways, was infinitely richer in truth. I heard through relatives now and then that my parents still spoke of me with a mixture of bitterness and disbelief, that they could not understand how I could have done something so final, so cruel in their eyes. They told others that I had robbed them of their role as parents, that I had humiliated them by eloping in secret. What they never admitted was that they had robbed themselves long before, when they handed me an envelope that told me exactly how little I mattered. Their bitterness was not about my decision, but about the mirror it held up to their own failures, a mirror they refused to look into. My brother, too, called once, his voice filled with that easy arrogance he had always carried, demanding to know if it was true that I had married without telling anyone. I confirmed it simply, without apology, and when he sputtered about tradition, about family honor, I reminded him gently that he had received $50,000 and a spectacle, while I had been handed scraps. He fell silent then, unable to argue, and I realized in that moment that my truth needed no defense. It was self-evident, written in the history of our lives. He hung up without another word, and I never heard from him again. What lingered most for me, though, was not the bitterness of what I had walked away from, but the sweetness of what I had stepped into. My marriage, born in quiet defiance, became the anchor of my new life. It was not defined by opulence or witnessed by crowds, but it was honest, and it was ours. Each morning when I woke beside him, I felt the steady peace of someone who no longer needed to chase love that was always withheld. I no longer measured myself against impossible scales, no longer bent myself into shapes for the sake of crumbs. I had created a life where my worth was not up for debate, where my happiness did not require validation from anyone but myself. And so, the epilogue of this story is not one of loss, but of rebirth. My parents may never understand what they gave me when they handed me that envelope, but I understand it clearly now. In trying to diminish me, they gave me clarity. In trying to limit me, they gave me freedom. Their $40 became the seed of my escape, the quiet insult that turned into my liberation. I will never hang photographs of that day for them to see, never send them proof of the vows I spoke, never allow them to claim a piece of a moment they did not value enough to invest in. That day belongs only to me, and in that ownership, I found a strength I never imagined possible. I eloped forever, not just from the wedding they expected, but from the cycle of neglect that had defined my life with them. And as I look forward now, into years filled with the simple, quiet joys of a life I chose for myself, I know that the truest revenge was never in grand gestures or public humiliations. It was in living fully, in loving honestly, in building a life that could not be touched by their indifference. They will remain in their house, surrounded by photographs of a son they chose to crown, haunted by the absence of the daughter they dismissed. And I will remain here, free, at peace, unbound, living a life that is no longer measured by their scales.